938 Live is Talkback.
Now, American journalist James Foley's 21-month abduction came to an abrupt end when he was brutally murdered by the militant and terrorist group known as the Islamic State. His captors had apparently demanded a ransom amounting to some $132 million. For the first 16 months after he was captured, Foley's family had no information of his whereabouts. They only learned that he was still alive from two Spanish journalists who had been freed by the Islamic State in March after a ransom for them had reportedly been paid. Earlier in the year, France and Spain had apparently paid ransoms through intermediaries to free their citizens. But American journalist David Rode, who escaped from Al-Qaeda and now writes for Thomson Reuters, said in the case of James Foley, the U.S. government refused to negotiate or to pay a ransom to the Islamic State. And so this raises the question, should countries negotiate with terrorists if their citizens are held for ransom? Should countries allow terror groups to influence their foreign policy through such means? Should the U.S. and its European allies agree on a perhaps coordinated response when it comes to kidnappings and ransom demands of terrorists? What would that outcome be?
Now, if you have thoughts on this issue, give us a call on 669-11938, or you can leave us your comments on Facebook, official 938 Live. Now, the U.S. State Department Deputy Spokeswoman Marie Harf made it very clear when asked about the reported ransom of $132 million by Islamic State militants for the release of Foley.
We do not pay ransoms. One of the main ways ISIL has been funded throughout this conflict has been from ransom payments that others have paid. We believe just in 2014 that's in the millions of dollars. So we believe that paying ransoms or making concessions would both put all Americans overseas at greater risk for kidnapping and in harm's way. But that ransoms would also fund and finance exactly the groups we are trying to degrade their capabilities.
Now, in a report by the British paper The Guardian, even the UK has made it well known in recent years that they refuse to pay ransoms should their citizens be captured abroad. They have even tried to stop families and even employers of hostages from making payments. And their argument is that paying ransoms rewards the terrorists for their criminal acts and it encourages future kidnappings. In a 2012 speech, David S. Cohen, the U.S. Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, also stated that the U.S. does not make deals, whether in ransom payments, in prisoner exchanges, or other policy concessions. Governments in North and West Africa have called on their Western counterparts to stop paying ransoms because of the destabilizing effect that terrorist groups have in their countries. Understandably, of course, governments are torn between bringing home to safety the loved ones of their citizens. The cruel reality, however, is that countries need to consider the consequences of allowing funds to be paid to terrorist organizations that intend to use the money for violence and to strike more terror. Now, do you think that ransom payments would only encourage further kidnappings? Would terrorists cease to see kidnapping as a way of boosting their funding if there is a global consensus on the payment of ransoms? Is there even a realistic way to avoid ransom payments altogether? What would it take before a global protocol is agreed upon to handle the demands of kidnappers and terrorists, and who would need to take the lead?
Call us on 669-11938. Now, think about this. If countries like the US and UK refuse to pay ransoms, would terror groups then get the idea, finally, that it's not worth kidnapping these people, therefore making it safer for their citizens in the long term? Ultimately, is there ever really a good outcome for governments and the people that they serve if ransoms are demanded and paid for kidnapped citizens? 669-11938 is our number. Joining us on the line today also is Associate Professor Dr. Kumar Ramakrishna. He's head of the Center of Excellence for National Security at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at NTU, the Nanyang Technological University. Good morning, Mr. Kumar.
Hi,
Dr. Kumar. First of all, let's look at the idea of why anyone, or especially a government, would negotiate with terrorists or separatist groups.
Well, sometimes you can understand the pressure from their own citizens, governments could face, especially if their nationals are being held overseas by groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, or for that matter, Abu Sayyaf in the southern Philippines. Governments have to be accountable to their electorates, and they want to be seen, while at the same time, they are expected to be seen to be tough on terrorism. They are also expected at the same time to be seen to be doing everything they can to bring home the hostages. And and it can really cause a lot of dilemmas for the governments. One just have to think back to, for example, the 1970s, the late 70s, 1979, when the U.S. embassy in Tehran was taken over by the Iranian militants, and that essentially really destroyed the presidency of Jimmy Carter, and essentially that hostage crisis could not be resolved. It only was resolved when President Reagan's transition team did a deal with the Iranians, and the hostages were released after 444 days. So governments can come under tremendous pressure to do something to just bring back the hostages. So I can understand how it can be a really big conundrum for governments.
Indeed, it is an ethical dilemma, and even if large amounts of cash doesn't change hands, there will be a deal, so to speak. Some concessions will be given. But objectively speaking, what is the alternative to this ethical dilemma, the alternative to paying a ransom, to negotiating with the terrorists?
The only alternative really is to not negotiate, not to give in. If a government wants to do that, they can, but then they have to ensure that whatever paramilitary operation they carry out is successful in freeing the hostages. Going back to the 1979 situation, 1980, the Carter administration did try rescue of the hostages, but that rescue operation was botched. And that essentially contributed to the overall failure to release the hostages in 1980. And they were, as mentioned, they were only released when the new administration came in. So the pressure is to do something, whatever it is, whether to negotiate, to give in, or to carry out a military operation. So whatever it is, the one option governments do not have is to do nothing.
Now, all major Western countries signed a G8 commitment not to pay ransoms to terror groups, and there was also a UN Security Council resolution along the same lines in January this year. However, we know that all these countries still have disparate approaches to this problem. To what extent do you think a unified approach is important here?
I'm not very confident that the international community will be able to come up with a unified approach which they will all agree to stick to in the near or even medium term. That's essentially because different countries, different governments have different interests and different capacities to deal with such, for example, hostages for kidnapping for ransom situations. So I would say that we can expect to see more piecemeal, national level, or individual approaches to the problem in the future.
Dr. Kumar, in 1991, Singapore Airlines Flight 117 was hijacked by 4 male passengers from Pakistan, and that aircraft landed in Singapore. And after the hijackers' demands were not met, the hijackers actually threatened to begin killing the hostages. But before their deadline expired, Singapore's commandos stormed the plane and killed those hijackers. Some say, there could have been other alternatives. Do you think that we could have?
I think based on that particular incident, we know because there was a dialogue between the authorities and the hijackers on SQ-117. There was a dialogue. Attempts were made to sort of try to persuade the hijackers not to carry on with their plans, but when that failed, ultimately they sent in the commandos. So in that particular case, 1991, I don't think the authorities had any option but to act, because the hijackers had demonstrated their intent by pushing out some of the cabin crew and who were from the plane onto the tarmac, and they were, injured. So they had to act. In that particular case, it's pretty clear they had to act. The government had to act.
To what extent do you think that was definitely a better option than just giving in to the hijackers' demands in that case?
Essentially, I think when you talk about negotiations, we have to figure out what we mean by negotiations. If by negotiations we mean dialogue, in the first instance, dialogue, talking to these guys to find out who they are, what they stand for, what exactly do they want, and to try to make a determination as to whether or not. Actually, if you talk to them, maybe you might be able to talk them out of it, And if you can save lives on all sides and come to a peaceful resolution, basically by that I mean getting them, the terrorists, the militants, not to go through with their plans, then why not? I think everyone, all governments should at least try to achieve that. That is basically dialogue. If by negotiation you mean giving in, like paying ransoms, then I think that's a very, very bad idea, because as was mentioned in the State Department clip,
right,
if you do it once, you have to keep doing it again, because essentially what you're doing when you give in once is you're incentivizing the other side to think, well, they have caved in, so this is obviously a successful strategy, so we'll just go and get more hostages, and very soon we'll be very rich.
Yeah, it's a means of bolstering their funds. What do you think? Where do you lie? Which side do you lie on when it comes to this ethical dilemma? Let's see what Peter has to say about this. Peter joins us now on 669-11938. Good morning, Peter.
Hi, good morning. I think that kidnapping is a very emotional issue, but I totally agree with the hardline stance that if you keep giving in, you create a very lucrative industry with little overheads. It's a brilliant and highly profitable thing. But just think about the people who get kidnapped. They don't get kidnapped in Katong or even in Tokyo or some of these places. They're in very difficult places. And the key thing as a Singaporean, I say, why go there? If you don't go there, you don't get kidnapped. And you don't cause a lot of hassle. And so I think that it's also about prudence by the people who go to these places, that they must understand that if they want to go to these places, there's a high risk. Or even, let's say you go to Philippines for some diving, and those spots are famous for being kidnap-prone areas. So don't dive there, just go somewhere else.
Thanks very much for that, Peter. Of course, we must note that many of the people who go there do so out of a sense of mission as well. In this case, we're talking about an American journalist,
right,
James Foley, who went there to cover the story, to bring those stories to the rest of the world.
That's right.
So that the rest of the world can take the necessary steps in order to help the civilian communities there as well.
But I think people who undertake these sort of missions already know the danger that they are in, and they are almost resigned to, the situation that they are going to be facing. Kumar, what do you think? But, as Peter brought up, there are certainly instances where we know that we can avoid certain areas, right? Certain high-risk areas.
That's right. In the case of Foley and others who were kidnapped, they are professionals. They are professional journalists, photojournalists.
Yeah.
And that's their job. They have to go out into those zones and capture the story, because that's what they are paid to do. Some of these journalists, they take prudent measures as far as possible. Others try to push the envelope, and these are the journalists who essentially end up getting the real scoop, the photograph or the story which really, is captures world attention. So there's a lot of incentive for journalists to keep taking risks, pushing the outside of the envelope, go that extra distance, and then get the story of the decade or something. So unfortunately, sometimes it really backfires, and then you get abducted, and ultimately, unfortunately, like what happened in this case of the poor gentleman Foley, it was a very, very sad ending. But having said that, if you're not a journalist, if you have no real mission or job to be doing in a conflict zone, then essentially you should stay out, because if you get involved in that sort of thing, you're essentially creating problems for not only your government but also your family to deal with down the road.
Now, Dr. Kumar, you mentioned earlier that if countries like the US and the UK refuse to pay ransoms demanded for their citizens by these terror groups, the groups would then get the idea that it's not worth kidnapping people from that country, therefore making it safer for those countries' citizens in the long run. However, would the militant groups and terror groups do so anyway, kidnap these people anyway for political reasons?
That's possible, because one has to think about what type of militant group you're talking about, what type of terrorist groups. In the past, in the 1970s or 60s, 70s, you had secular nationalists or even communist organizations that they're trying to extract concessions from the government of the day, whether it's political recognition. In the case of the Communist Party of Malaya, they're always trying to get political recognition to operate above ground and rather than clandestinely or illegally, whether you're trying to get recognition for national territory, whether it's IRA in Ireland or PLO in Palestine. They were always trying to use violence to extract concessions, political concessions for the government. So essentially, governments could leverage on that to try to do a deal in the past if they wanted to.
Right.
If they wanted to. And in fact, because the governments were open to negotiation with, for example, the Communist Party, by 1989, after many decades, that conflict ended with the signing of the peace agreements between the CPM and the Thai and Malaysian government. So discussions, negotiations sometimes can bear fruit. But if you're talking about terrorist groups of today's variety, which is different species, they are religiously motivated. They like, for example, Al-Qaeda or ISIS, when they take hostages or when they capture people, they want to make a statement. They don't really want to negotiate. They don't really want to do a deal. They essentially want to punish the unbelievers.
They want to terrorize them.
Of all the filth.
Right, and terrorize them as well. So
right.
even if you don't get a ransom payment, you are making a political statement by terrorizing the citizens of that country.
They will still try to extract money, because all terrorist groups, whatever their ideology is, they want money because they need money to function. But ultimately, the best option is to stay away. I mean, ordinary citizens should just stay away from such conflict zones. And even if you're a professional, take due care what you're doing in such zones.
All right. 669-11-938. We still want to hear from you. The question is, of course, should countries negotiate with terrorists if their citizens are held for ransom? We want to hear from you after news and sports right here on 938 Live.
American journalist James Foley's 21-month abduction came to an abrupt end when he was brutally murdered by the militant and terrorist group known as the Islamic State. Should countries negotiate with terrorists if their citizens are held for ransom? His captors had apparently demanded a ransom amounting to some $132 million. Now, we've also heard that Secretary of State John Kerry yesterday confirmed the release in Syria of Peter Theo Curtis. You've been hearing this in the news. He's an American journalist who had been held for 2 years by the militant group al-Nusra, Jabhat al-Nusra. It's an affiliate of Al-Qaeda. Now, the family of Curtis has said in a statement that they were assured by officials that no money changed hands and they mediated for Theo's release on a humanitarian basis. Is it really possible to get things done that way? What are the alternatives to paying a ransom? 669-11938 is our number. We're also joined today by Associate Professor Dr. Kumar Ramakrishna, Head of the Center of Excellence for National Security at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at NTU, Nanyang Technological University. Now, Dr. Kumar, even if ransom payments are not formally made, what really is the situation like on the ground in specific cases? For instance, the use of intermediaries or less direct methods?
I mean, that's a very common way by which governments actually try to resolve hostage crisis involving such militant groups. They don't want to do it openly or, in the glare of publicity. They essentially go quietly through private channels to sort of try to strike a deal with the militant groups, the terrorist groups, and this is actually quite common. So it can be done. It can happen. That is a middle way for some of the situations to be resolved.
When you talk about striking a deal, you're not necessarily talking about money changing hands, are you?
Money could be pretty much part of the equation. Yes, it could be. But in this case, this interesting case of the Al-Nusra group apparently releasing this other hostage.
Yes, Peter Theo Curtis.
Yeah.
That's right. This is interesting. I mean, that might be, and if it's for humanitarian reasons, that's really interesting because this is very unusual. So my own immediate reaction is there is a backstory to this, and ultimately I think this is possibly leads back to the wider competition between the Al-Nusra and ISIS, because going back to the origins, ISIS was essentially once part of the Al-Qaeda milieu. They were actually formerly Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but they became ISIS, and what happened was just about a couple of years ago, or perhaps last year, ISIS fell out with Al-Qaeda Central. Ayman al-Zawahiri, Osama bin Laden's deputy, could not control the leadership of ISIS, and ISIS is now trying to present itself as the leading militant organization, and Al-Qaeda, they say, are no longer relevant. But al-Nusra is still loyal to Al-Qaeda. So this might actually be an attempt for propaganda. Al-Nusra is trying to say that, look, we are more humane and more reasonable than ISIS. This is to appeal not to the West, not to Western audiences, but essentially to their own constituency, their supporters who give them funding, that, we are less barbaric than ISIS.
So other potential recruits as well, right?
Yes. So there is an internal contest going on as well, so one should be mindful of this.
It's important to understand the psychology of the terrorists and militants. Earlier you mentioned that right now, one of the alternatives to governments, an alternative to paying a ransom, is to talk them out of it. What do governments need to understand about these religious-based terrorists in order to tailor a proper approach to talk them out of it?
First of all, I don't think you can actually try that approach with religiously motivated terrorists, because by definition, those who don't belong to that particular religion are unbelievers. And there's really nothing to negotiate with unbelievers. However, if you're dealing with a militant group that has a more secular-oriented ideology, that has really relatively clearer and more tangible ideas about what they want from you, then there is some leverage there, you see, for whether it's a political recognition, greater autonomy, greater control over particular swaths of territory, then there is something to talk about. But if you're dealing with a group that essentially doesn't even recognize your status, who basically feels that you are not part of what they think is the religion, then essentially it's either you convert or you be killed.
What are the other diplomatic alternatives, perhaps, in such cases, Dr. Kumar?
The diplomatic initiatives would have to be at the international level, where essentially a consensus has to be arrived at between the relevant governments to sort of agree on a common position. There is no real diplomatic initiative to be done in direct, in my view at least, in direct negotiations or discussions with the militant, religiously motivated groups themselves. And essentially, it's not just diplomatic. There's also a counter-ideological element where essentially civil societies in all the affected countries have to try to persuade their vulnerable populations not to buy into these extremist ideologies, to dry up the recruiting streams to such organizations. And finally, on the ground, there has to be a strong military effort. So you have diplomatic international level, counter-ideological elements, and a military effort in a comprehensive approach to deal with the problem.
Like a lot of governments have said that they deal with it by channeling enormous resources and manpower into recovering the captive rather than paying off a ransom. 669-11938 is our number. Give us a call. Tell us how you feel about this.
Okay, we have Arif holding on. Hi, Arif. Thanks for holding on.
Yes, thank you, sir. I want to know why we don't talk about the root cause of those groups, terrorist groups. Today we are giving them for name of terrorists. When we have two examples in just ISIS and Taliban, Afghanistan. When this war in Russia in there, we bring all these groups, these old people, funding them by Europe, by Americans, and we ask them go Afghanistan and fight against Russia. When they are out of their control, then they say they are a terrorist. Today, same we are having in ISIS when they are they are fighting against Syria for Bashar al-Assad, and we say they are a very good people. No, today they are out of control, and we are giving them name of terrorists. Why we don't talk about for roots where this come for groups?
Right. So the motivations of these groups need to be looked at more closely. Dr. Kumar, your comments?
I think it's a fair point. One of the difficulties is it's very difficult to forecast the long-term effects of policy. I mean, if you look back, you want to ask me what is the real root. When the gentleman talks about root causes, at least one of the real roots of this current conflict in that region goes all the way back to the beginning of the late 1970s, after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the rise in the 1980s of the Mujahideen fighting against the Soviet occupiers, and the support given by the U.S. CIA to the Pakistani military regime to sort of create a fighting force against the occupying Soviets. And ultimately what happened was when that conflict ended, there was a question of, okay, we have all these guys all trained and ready to fight, but the war has ended. What did they do? And ultimately what happened was the group that later became Al-Qaeda grew out of that. And many of the fighters from Southeast Asia that went to Afghanistan came back and they formed Jamaat Islamiyah. So in 1980, a senior U.S. official was asked, by a very perceptive journalist, are we taking a risk to arm all these people? But at that time, the greater threat was the Cold War. Cold War, global communism was the bigger threat. Nobody actually could see far enough to, maybe one or two very sharp, perceptive individuals could, but most people couldn't. And this is the problem. It's a problem of long-term political and geopolitical forecasting. It can be a problem, and sometimes we suffer from what is called blowback.
Mm.
Yeah, so that's
and myopia, of course. So perhaps governments need to think about some of these long-term consequences as well when developing certain strategic positions. Let's see what Fong has to say about this. Hi, Mr. Fong.
Hi, good morning. I just wanted to try to understand Dr. Kumar's argument about incentives. I mean, if we defer the punishment of the terrorists and get the hostage out and then punish them later, wouldn't that be a sufficient disincentive?
What do you think, Dr. Kumar?
If we pay them first and punish them later,
yes.
You see, if for example, this ISIS had received 132 million first, that would have really helped them build more capacity and bribe more tribes to sort of join them and then become stronger, you see. And so ultimately it's providing oxygen to them to sort of carry out their activities. So I can understand why governments do not really want to do that if they can help it, because if you provide money to them, it's not always going to be a good solution. For example, in early in the past decade, I understand that the Bush administration paid some money to the Abu Sayyaf group to get the release of a couple of American missionaries that were abducted. After the money had been paid, one of the missionaries still passed away in a firefight with the Philippines armed forces. So it's very risky. It's very risky.
What do you think it is going to take for countries to have a global protocol on handling the demands of kidnappers and terrorists? You mentioned a multi-pronged approach to dealing with such kidnapping issues. What is it going to take for countries to develop a united front on that multi-pronged approach?
Yeah, well, it may be happening because after, I think ISIS, the video of the beheading of Mr. Foley may have inadvertently sparked a global reaction, and many governments were horrified. In fact, on Twitter, there's been a lot of revulsion, and this is usually something like this. If it captures global attention and generates a global revulsion, the governments find the political will to come together to talk and do something about it. So we may be actually seeing it happen at this point in time. The continuing reaction to the Foley murder.
All right. Thank you very much, Associate Professor Dr. Kumar Ramakrishna. He's head of the Center of Excellence for National Security at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at the Nanyang Technological University. You can still talk to us on our Facebook official 938 Live. Thank you very much for all your calls this morning.